Good morning, everybody. I think actually my presentation does segue very well with Bill's. And to some extent, chronologically, there's overlap with what we're interested in, what we're working on. However, we're taking a very different kinds of approaches to it. So what I want to do this morning is summarize a few of the things that we're working on, especially about architecture. And then secondly, give you my take on how a lot of the new information that we're seeing in Mongolia is feeding into both theoretical and global interests in terms of how we interpret archaeology. Somewhere around 1986, I went to a very small gathering, much smaller than this one, in which the two American specialists in Mongolia were speaking. One of whom had never been to Mongolia, and I thought, well, what do I know about pastoralists and empires and Genghis Khan and things? And one of the speakers showed a slide similar to this. This one was actually taken by Bill Honeychurch, though. But the presentation, which kind of blew me away in a sense that, wait a minute, there's big cities on this steppe? And I thought, well, okay, that's something of quite a bit of interest to me, but I'm gonna put that aside, and I worked on lots of other things in the interim. But over the last 20 years now, about 20 years, I've had an opportunity to go to Mongolia and look at some of these issues in more detail. Now, some of the key characteristics, which probably many of you know, but these are sort of the things, they're fundamental concepts that I use to think about how I'm conducting the analysis. I think it's great with the lights out, personally. Yeah, I don't think we need the lights unless someone has a problem. So issues of mobility, and when I say scale, all these things occur at very different kinds of scales. And this is brought to the forefront for me if we think about what is the analysis, kind of the analysis that we're doing. And so my concern is both analysis at the household level, but also the more collective action, larger groups. Extra local interactions, meaning sort of long distance. Some of the things that Bill was just talking about. Non-fixed property, obviously the herd animals. Dispersed control hierarchies. I'm always taken by some of the historical documentation that we have for all the early Chinese histories, but also later material, how complex the social landscape really is. And so I think those who are not specialists in this region expect it to be sort of this vacant landscape, but it's not. It's actually, the partitions of the landscape are well known. Pastoralism as a economic foundation, as well as other things. And I'm glad to see there's so much new work going on with understanding the role of agriculture. This is the chronology. Over breakfast, we were talking about this, and I couldn't remember some of the things here, but this is the chronology of major polities. I usually use the word empire that I work with. This chronology is based primarily on the historical documents. When did the Chinese say the Xiongnu Empire started? Okay, right there. 200 BC or 220 BC, something like that. So these are not necessarily the kind of anthropological time units that we might use if we were going to analyze some other issues. But it's a widely accepted chronology. So you see there's a long history there of these polities. And one of the critiques that we've had in the past is that, oh yes, sure, the nomads had an empire, but it was ephemeral, and it didn't really last very long. But if you compare this chronology to almost any other place in the world, there are obvious exceptions, but let's say the Indian subcontinent and all the empires that existed there, it's very comparable. We can also replicate this in some of our simulations. Probably the new piece of evidence I have to present is this map that shows a distribution of architecture, sites that have architecture, meaning fortified communities, palace complexes, garrison posts, other kinds of sites like that. This is not a comprehensive map by any means, as been pointed out to me by my Russian colleagues, as well as many others. There are lots more sites, especially in Transbaikalia, as well as southern Tuva, that might relate, do in fact relate to the Xiongnu and other empires. But what this is a sample. And so the sample, as you can see, is very clearly biased towards Mongolia, because that's where I've done my travels, primarily. What the sample shows is almost all of these sites, the vast majority, are large defensive enclosures, usually square or rectangular. Most of them have very little standing architecture inside the walls. So one of my questions has always been, well, what was the rest of that space utilized for? We know that it's been very difficult to document ephemeral campsites, but there's lots of new work going on in that area. But at the same time, many of my colleagues have said, well, there just isn't anything in there, because I want to try to say, well, there were tent communities inside the walls, but there actually maybe I do need some evidence for that. So right now, there's not a lot. I'll show you a few examples of these kinds of places. This is the Citadel at Harbalgus, or Ordu-Balak, which is the Uyghur Empire capital, which was that earlier photograph, shows the wall. This is just a citadel, the city itself. And to me, it's the clearest example we have on the eastern steppe of a real city. Extends for quite a few square kilometers. Then we have palace complexes, such as this one at Shazanpok on the northern edge of the Gobi Desert, probably a Mongol period. It's one of the few places in Mongolia that I've ever been where you can literally walk around and find things, like coins, like Chinese coins, pieces of porcelain, wagon parts, the bronze bushing centers for the wheels, things like that, still on the surface today. These are some maybe more typical large enclosures. The one on the right is kind of an exception in that it does have a lot of internal architecture. This appears to be what I call a forced community, people that were relocated by the empire for purposes of the empire, probably on a frontier zone. So I think there's several sources of new and emerging evidence. Probably the most significant is the full coverage survey intensive regional analyses that are taking place now in Mongolia and also the larger region of Inner Asia. And that's producing lots of additional detail and new kinds of sites and other information. So, and then we're also, in conjunction with that, is the application of new archaeological technologies in DNA research and other areas as well. There's increasing efforts to synthesize the data that emerges from these surveys, and that is also producing new ways of thinking about the past. The new analytical methods I mentioned, and then I think also reading the early documents in light of new theoretical approaches. I think it is pretty common to think of you still see the term all the time of the tribes, the Mongol tribes, or the other empires were composed of tribes. And so there's an ethnic foundation in the early documents, ethnicity as well as a kinship foundation to the way the early documents describe who the people to the north were. However, there's also, along with that, lots of parallel information that suggests that many of these tribes were in fact corporate groups that were multi-ethnic in a variety of ways. So we have quite a bit of evidence of that. And I think that fits in with how, at least I interpret early empires, in that they are, in fact, a conglomeration of a lot of different things. And by my definition, an empire is, in fact, multi-ethnic. And so the empires, for the purposes of the empire, keep moving people around and reassigning them to different subgroups. So here's some, I have a colleague who loves to do the spatial analysis, and he convinced us that we should try to draw a line around where these empires actually were. And that's a really hard thing to do, right? There's no boundary markers per se, and I'm sure there weren't any at the time, nor are there today. So it's kind of, it's in a way, it's a mathematical question. So it's not as if we're saying that's exactly the boundary of an empire, but we're saying that to an order of magnitude, it's probably somewhere in that area. So if you actually look at the scale of these areas spatially, you have some potential for analysis as well. So I was sitting over here listening to Bill. I was thinking, I'm sort of sorry I included this particular slide, because it really takes my discussion in a different direction. But I wanted to point out that a lot of the data that we're using in Mongolia is feeding into other kinds of theoretical perspectives. And this is a sort of a set of images about how society changes. You could call it cultural evolution, or just a change in general that I've recently published called dynamic trajectories. So my point is that there's a lot of contribution that the Mongolia data is feeding into that I think has global implications for how we look at the emergence of society, the sustainability of it, and we're using that in a variety of ways. Another way that we've used quite a lot is the computational modeling, agent-based modeling, and what you see here is kind of like the shorthand version of how one of these models might work. There's a physical environment, weather, social systems, herd animals, and other things. You know, in essence, this slide represents an elaborate hypothesis for how we think an entire social system might work, based on different regions of central Mongolia primarily. So one of the things that I do is I help design agent-based models. And once I've designed them, someone then puts it into computer code, and then I test it to see if it works. So every part of the model has to be calibrated against some set of real-world data so that we know that the whole thing is functioning together in a viable way. We've used this a number of times. The model is called Households World. And the interesting thing about it is it's also pegged to real places in Mongolia. Now, we don't have, does not give us information on, say, whether or not how a settlement pattern in a particular valley emerged. But it does tell us a lot about how sustainable, how resilient pastoral social systems might be. So keep your eye open for more publications on this. So I'll return now, I'm starting to close up, with some ideas about empire and what we've sort of the conclusions we've drawn from that database of constructions on the landscape. I like the idea of continuity. I think there's a lot of continuity. It's not just Mongolian continuity, however, it also extends through much of China and Central Asia as well. But there's interesting features certainly that make the Mongolia information distinctive. Another fact, which is also true in other areas, settlements seldom arose through accretion. So if we have a large fortified square complex out on the steppe, It's not as if it's built on top of many other earlier versions. It is a planned entity that was put down probably in a relatively short period of time, utilized, then abandoned at some point, and not reoccupied. Now, certainly we do have examples of reoccupation, and that's even more true later in time. The Mongol capital at Karakorum is a good example of a place that does have an accretional history, but by and large, in my data set of maybe 75 sites, it's very rare. Settlement organization reflected unique mobility aspects. So the sites are positioned for the benefit of a herding economy. Basically is what I would say about that. The roofed environment, when the empires decided to build something, it's generally occupied by specialists, but sometimes means farmers also, craft specialists or merchants or others. It also housed religious specialists as well as temple complexes. Although you may know sort of famously that the Mongol Khans were not often at the capital, they were often at sort of a regional temple complex or a palace complex. The forced community was also a common aspect. Empires were not kind and gentle to populations that they conquered, and they often moved people around for their own purposes. So here's my conclusions, basically. We're seeing now settlement systems with real chronology. The chronology is becoming more and more detailed, and that is that actually may be the single most important aspect in addition to the regional coverage surveys. We're also seeing a reinterpretation of the relationship with China, giving more credit, cultural identity, and history to the pastoralist empires. Communities were the product of the empire, not the source. Now, if you think about that, if we go to Mesopotamia and look at how we see the emergence of the first states, they're almost always linked to particular villages and complexes that grew through accretion over time. So rather than being the source of empire, the settlements are a byproduct of empire. Mobility and pastoralism are not contradictory to complex social landscapes. So that's one of my concluding messages. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. We actually have time for questions now, about 5 minutes before the next speaker. I have one question from the basis of ignorance. Those 3 maps of empires you showed, every single one of them touched the sea. Now, is this important, particularly important factor, say, for trade, for a certain kind of resources, or was it quite accidental?
Some of the, so the question is of the 3 pictures I showed of the empires all touched the sea. That, I think, is more a factor of those particular empires had their origins in northeast China. And so the trade component in relationship to the sea is not really very strong in terms of the relationship with the steppe. So it's probably not much of a factor.
So we could say they're different kinds of empires then?
I would say so, very much so. Yeah.
Thank you.
So,
Dan,
a little bit of a contradiction in your interpretation about China, because most of the sites that you showed look like they've come out of China in terms of their architecture, rather than being stimulated by things that were happening in Mongolia. So I just wonder if you might comment more on that.
I think there's a broad pattern among the steppe empires to, I mean, that's a very strong and important interpretation, and it has certainly my colleagues who work in China point this out to me on a routine basis, that the architecture looks like Chinese architecture. Well, it also looks like Kazakhstan architecture. It also looks like Central Asian architecture. We also have examples of Islamic architecture in Mongolia, but my guess is that the style of the architecture is less important than how the patterns that we see on the landscape. So for instance, Haram probably had temple complexes that very much looked like Chinese style, may very well have been built by Chinese laborers and architects. But I don't think that the way that they're utilizing the steppe is very reflective, nor is it a reason to say, well, it's just what we're seeing on the steppe is just, an extension of Chinese influence. I think it's a little different than that. So, but I acknowledge that as an important relationship. There's a question way back there.
Actually, along the line you're talking about, in actual fact, the Mongols of a certain period had a profound influence on Chinese architecture. And that can be seen by comparing Karakoram to what's left of Beijing.
That's actually a very good point. I mean, because the influences go both ways.
Yes.
And we, I think in many ways we're tied, our interpretations are tied to the fact that the early Chinese historians wrote things down. And we don't have a comparable text, and by and large, from Mongolia or other Eurasian peoples. So, but that is an important fact. So.
There's one over here.
There is a photographic record or a pictorial record in the murals in Karakoram of what the buildings looked like in the ancient period.
Yes.
Even though it's not written down, they couldn't write, so they used pictures. Sorry about that.
There's a gentleman over here had his hand.
Okay, I'll get to him later.
Hi. Sorry, I just want the pictures you had of the steppe empires. Why would it be limited to Mongolia and that part of Central Asia? Weren't nomadic empires the norm across Eurasia from the beginning of time, I guess? So the Abbasids and the Umayyads are de facto nomadic empires, are they not?
I think so, yeah. So if we were to redraw a map of Eurasia, we would see probably across Central Asia, we could do a similar map that at a particular time period showed where all these different political entities were at a particular time. So it just happens to be my data set is that list of maybe 13 or 14 polities and their focus, which happens to be Eastern Eurasia.
Yes.
You were talking about the empty spaces in the settlements. So who lived there and where did they live?
There's often architectural mounds that probably are for elites or religious purposes. There might be a temple complex inside the walled settlement, but there's not most of the time there's very little evidence for domestic architecture. It is almost all specialized buildings, elite buildings. But even then, if we actually do the math, which I've done, the built space inside the defensive walls is usually 1% to 2% of the space. So the rest of it is open.
Well, where are all the burials?
Well, that's a good question too. Most of the time, I don't know where the burials are. At Karakoram, in the Mongol capital, the Mongolian and German expedition there has identified, I think, 4 different cemeteries scattered around the outer walls of the site. So presumably there are other cemeteries, and then like at Ordu Balak, there's elite burial complexes, some which have produced really interesting new information with wall inscriptions and things like that. But by and large, I don't know where most of the people are buried. I don't know. So maybe someone knows.
Do you know that they are in-ground burial, or might they have a different custom altogether about it?
Well, I think they're mostly in-ground burials, but I don't know. I mean, we often, I mean, yeah, I guess they are. But you would think that if there's a large settlement that's been there for several hundred years, or a couple hundred years, that there should be large cemeteries. But
Yes.
by and large, I don't see them. I don't know where they are, and I think it's partly because people haven't really looked.
Last question now, thank you.
Thank you. This is a great presentation. I learned a lot. I just wonder, when you mentioned that settlement organizations reflect this unique mobility aspect, could you elaborate on that a bit more?
Right, so the full coverage surveys that we're seeing in several regions are that Dr. Honeychurch, for instance, has been at the forefront of doing that. Sorry, Bill, that you have. And Josh Wright over there too, but there's other people in the audience who have done that. Now, what you find is very little material on the landscape, but it is actually there. And from that, you can identify either individual campsites or clusters of campsites. And it's getting to the point where we can understand those relationships in time, because we have to be able to separate things out chronologically. So now we're seeing some settlement patterns in the Eigengol area that Josh and Bill were very much leading the work there. We see relationships between those settlement patterns and the local constructed center. So is this a region of an empire? How does that relationship work in the political sense? Not quite clear, but there seems to be a relationship between the hinterland of the administrative centers and the settlement distributions. Does that help?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.